structure very different, very informal, is the entry of this one group of actors whom we call the middlemen or the land aggregators. And mind you, these are not associated with government offices, but they play a very important role to obtain land parcels. And they play a very important role to come about with a process called land leasing mechanism. And we have seen this happening in the state of Gujarat, in near the Chariha village, where the land aggregators purchased land from the lower caste residents at a lesser price and sold it at a higher price to the SPPs. We are seeing something similar happen in Pavagada and Karnataka through land leasing mechanism through special purpose vehicles. But for the sake of today's conversation, we'll focus on only one aspect, which is access to commons and what happens when there is a diversion of common land for large RE infrastructure. And this brings us to our core focus of our discussion today, that what is this customary tenor's right within large RE? For me, in a very layman's language, I would say it refers to the right of local resource-dependent population who have a local use value of these land, for instance, growing their food on these very spaces, and whose enclosure, whose acquisition can rupture the very relations of production and can exacerbate inequalities like livelihood, like household reproduction, particularly for marginalized communities like women, pastoral, tribal, and development. Personally, for me, I believe any enclosure or any rupture of these rights can cause what I call the socio-ecological friction. Now, what are these socio-ecological friction? I'll give an example from our recent field visit to a very small panchayat in western Rajasthan, where we were talking to a group of women who outlined how they were okay traveling from their house to these common land spaces for grazing, for fuel, for fodder. Because for them, the space from their home to these spaces meant something what we often call emotional geography. What are these emotional geographies? They are nothing but those very connections that women make with each other. It is a space where they are away from the patriarchal gaze for some time. And it's also a very non-material space where these women foster a very non-material relationship. Now, when these lands get diverted for large RE infrastructure, we do not know what happens to these non-material spaces. For one, we know they do get ruptured, but then what happens to them after that is something I would definitely want the panelists to also touch upon. We also have a couple of pictures which I want the audience to see from our field visit. On the screen, we can see a white patch, which is the Nok village. The Nok village is a very small part of the Nok Panchayat in the Falodi district of western Rajasthan. And as the picture clearly depicts how the Nok village is an island and it's surrounded by a sea of solar power projects around. And perhaps this could be similar for any village in western Rajasthan in the next 5 or 10 years. So this is something for the audience to ponder upon. This is a picture from a very recent field visit to the Google solar power in the Bikaner district of western Rajasthan. And as you can see, as far as your eyes go, you will only find a sea of solar panels. This depicts the local community and how they interact with livestock, particularly also for mobility purposes, for grazing, and so on and so forth. While we're also referring to these areas where solar power projects are coming, we also need to remember these are extremely water-stressed areas. And the communities have found a way to cope with the issue. So this is just one small community pond which is used for grazing purposes. This is another interesting picture made by my colleague. While most of you have seen how transmission tower looks like, this is a picture from beneath the panel. So how do you look at the solar, how do you look at the transmission towers from beneath? This is a 765 kilowatt of transmission power. And yeah, so that's it. That's how I could lay out the issues in large RE infrastructure, and the focus of our discussion today being that on customer need, right? If the audience have any question, please park it. I believe it might be answered through our analysis. So this we can welcome our panelists on the Take a seat now. Right, so we'll begin with a round of introduction before we actually go into the Q&A session. We'll start with Professor Himanshu Upadhyay. Professor Himanshu has a deep interest in teaching environmental policy and regulatory framework. His doctoral research is from JNU New Delhi, and he explored the cultural, social, and economic lives of bovine animals in late outside his academic work, he with state governments as well as grassroots organizations. She has worked closely with developmental projects in South Asia, Africa, Central Europe with a focus on gender mainstream. Next we have my colleague, Dr. Anuj Goel, who leads the Inclusive Renewable Thematic Area Center for Energy, Environment and People. He holds a PhD in public policy from IIM Calcutta with research expertise spanning energy transitions, economic and spatial transformation, environmental policy, and the electoral implications of welfare programs. Beyond his academic work, Anuj is an avid reader with deep interest in the history of food, Indian political philosophy, Indian literature, and so on. And finally, on the panel, we have Dr. Mohish Rao, who is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Law, University of Delhi. He holds LLM degree from the University of Mumbai and PhD from the University of Delhi. Before joining the University of Delhi, he was associated with Singhani and Co-LLP Mumbai. During his legal practice in the High Court of Bombay, he also taught LLB students in the Rizvi Law College, Mumbai. Simultaneously during his practice, Dr. Rao has authored various articles in renowned journals and magazines. Can we please have a round of applause for our So with this, we'll begin with the Q&A session on our subject. We'll go about through 3 rounds of Q&A so that we can have, and after each round we can have a better understanding of what customary land rights within large REs. We'll start with Professor Himanshu. Sir, you have worked and you have been closely associated with social movements like the Narmada Bachao Andolan. How did the state back then perceive customary or use-based rights during the 1980s and 90s during land acquisition? And has it changed today, let's say, post-2015?
To begin with, the discourse on traditionally established access rights, which is very different from the land titles. So, having the title to the land is the cultivation. And that in academic has started round back. So if you look at anthropological survey of India's work by Rai Chaudhary, where he looks at transient fishing port of Jambuddin Island. And they are using this small island called Jambuddin in the Sundarban Delta just during the season called Shabbat. And why do they use this island? Because they are fishing in the open sea. They get access to the island because there is a creek that takes them to the island. This anthropologist spends an entire year studying this transient fishing community. He doesn't stay on island throughout the day. They access the island year after year during October onwards. They establish transient fishing camps. And in those years, they used to be penalized by the forest department. So forest department used to give them the permit, they used to take measurement of the boats, and they issued this permit. These people had record of those permits. Okay. But in the year 2002, when the Ministry of Environment and Forest, under the directions, went ahead helping people who ministry believed were encroachers on forest. Although year after year they have issued those permits, the same has been the department issued the permits. So traditionally established access rights, even when documentation is removed, has not been upheld, and that's a sad part. And I think the Supreme Court has erred very drastically, because I told this book was published by the Ministry of India. Thanks to this debate, it got the repeat. The second repeat came once the court was adjudicating this case. And the conservation lobby was arguing that, and again, the corporate interests on the forest land, the traditionally established access rights and people's value, they are juxtaposed in such a big battle that Sahara gets to claim 700 acres of the land in Sundarbans Island to develop ecotourism. And what kind of ecological sensitivism that would be presented. But this traditional transient issue of farming has been so well documented in the activity, and the book actually goes on the deposition in the Supreme Court case. So what do our courts, when upholding constitutional rights, do about the academic knowledge that emerges from academia is something that we need to wonder about. Given all these examples, what happened in the case of Unbundling versus Union of India, and how that majority judgment was given, and the silver line in the dark clouds was the minority judgment. And I would appeal all of you sitting here to read the minority judgment written by S-116, who believe otherwise, but who was minority judge on the 3-judge panel. So people tend to go ahead with what is the majority judgment. And back then, when I was a student, I was reading majority judgment, and the lack of logic, the lack of legal logic, the lack of persuasiveness, that majority judgment looks like an essay written in the praise of last night. To be very honest, and that was the push that made me leave the academic campus behind and come and work with Dr. Unbundling.
Thank you, sir. I think that's an interesting point where you mentioned how certain livelihood practices are left outside mainstream law. To come to Shikra, ma'am, you have worked extensively within gender and agricultural and rights. And considering how we know in India and within the broader South Asian context, women lack formal ownership of land. Women lack control over their land. In that regard, how do you firstly look at the formal tenure rights in women and gender? And also, can you extend this discussion to customary and land rights and so on?
So, मुझे लगता है कि जहाँ औरतों के पास जमीन के ऊपर लिखा हुआ अधिकार है, वहाँ उनको कई जगह दूसरे तरीकों से एक्सेस प्राप्त होता है. कई बार ये रिलेशनल तौर पे होता है कि पति की संपत्ति है तो मिले पाएगा, पिता की संपत्ति है तो रहने का उस तरह की चीज़. और दूसरे कॉन्टेक्स्ट में कई बार खाली यूजर राइट्स होते हैं, जिसको कि हम ज़्यादातर फॉरेस्ट के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देखते हैं. कॉमन्स पर एक्सेस की बात होती है तो कई बार सीजनल एक्सेस होती है. कई बार कुछ कस्टमरी लॉज में ऐसा भी है कुछ ट्राइबल कम्युनिटी में कि ओवरऑल सिस्टम तो बहुत लीनियर है कि जमीन जो है पिता से पुत्र को ही जाएगी, लेकिन कहीं कहीं पर जैसे कि झारखंड में एक तरह के टैबन होती है, तो उसमें क्या होता है कि ट्रेडिशन ये था कि परिवार में जिस परिवार में लड़की पैदा हुई है वहाँ पर एक छोटा सा जमीन का टुकड़ा उसके लिए सुरक्षित रहेगा कि उसको कभी ज़रूरत हो तो वो आगे आगे रह सके. पर ओवर टाइम इस तरह की प्रथाएं, इस तरह के कस्टम एकदम खत्म हो गई है। पर जो चीज़ जब कस्टमरी लॉ की और औरतों के पास अधिकार नहीं होने की बात करते हैं, तो मुझे लगता है कि जो मैंने झारखंड में खास करके ट्राइबल कम्युनिटीज के साथ देखा, वो ये देखा कि उनको कस्टमरी लॉ रेजिडेंस का राइट, मेंटेनेंस का राइट देता है। और मैंने ये देखा कि समाज ये मानता है कि औरत को तो रहना, खाना, मेंटेनेंस मिल रहा है, तो इसे और क्या चाहिए। लेकिन मैंने ये देखा कि ये कैसे ज़्यादा खतरनाक है। औरत ज़्यादा खतरनाक ऐसे है कि कस्टमरी लॉ औरत के नाम पर जमीन आ नहीं सकती, उसको अधिकार मानते नहीं। तो अगर, और स्पेशली फॉर सिंगल वुमन, फॉर एग्जाम्पल किसी महिला की पति की डेथ हो गई, तो अभी उसको जमीन का किसी भी प्रकार अधिकार नहीं मिल सकता। वो खाली जब तक जीवित है वो वहाँ रह सकती है, खा सकती है। तब होता क्या है कि इफेक्ट होता ही है कि जमीन का अधिकार परिवार में किसी मेल को मिल जाएगा। अगर उस महिला का बेटा है जो माइनर है, उसको मुझे हो जाएगा तो उसको मिलेगा, या फिर उसके परिवार में देवर या जेठ या फिर किसी और रिलेशन में उनके लड़के उसको मिलेगा। पर ये चीज़ खतरनाक इसलिए है क्योंकि क्या होता है कि मैं मेरी वोकैबुलरी में उन पुरुषों को ओनर्स इन मीटिंग कहती हूँ कि जब ये महिला रास्ते से हटेगी तब हमें इस जमीन का पूरा अधिकार मिलेगा। तब होता क्या है कि वो चाहते हैं कि ये औरत किसी भी तरह मेरे रास्ते से हटे, क्योंकि वो जब तक जिंदा है और वहाँ रह रही है तब तक तो उसको रहने खाने का हक कस्टमरी है। लेकिन द मोमेंट शी रीमैरिज या फिर वो वहाँ से छोड़ के चली गई, उसने 1 साल वहाँ नहीं रही, कहती एज ए रिजल्ट जो पूरा सिस्टम है, स्पेशली और परिवार के महिलाएं भी कई बार उसमें शामिल होती हैं, उस महिला के ऊपर हर प्रकार की वायलेंस है, and which very often I have seen resulting into witchcrafting, witch hunting, and all of this happens because the community believes that there is something called spirits, जो कि एक मनिजित स्पिरिट होती है, and if there is a spirit it is also a punishment। तो मैं करीब 5 साल पहले से मैंने झारखंड जाना शुरू किया था, और इसीलिए जाना शुरू किया था कि वहाँ के कुछ महिला संगठन मुझसे मिले और उन्होंने बोला कि हम जब महिलाओं के साथ काम करते हैं, एक महिलाओं के साथ खास करके, तो हम बहुत बार जब हिंसा की घटनाओं को सुलझाने की कोशिश करते हैं तो हमें ये दिखता है कि उसके जड़ में तो जमीन का विषय है। जब तक हम उसको हल नहीं करेंगे तब तक हम हिंसा से उसको कैसे दूर निकाल सकते हैं। तो और जब मैं वहाँ पे अध्ययन करी थी, मैंने एक और भी बहुत बड़ी महत्वपूर्ण चीज़ देखी, वो ये कि ये जो कस्टमरी राइट भी है, मेंटेनेंस का राइट, ये भी ओवर टाइम बहुत डिक्लाइन कर रहा है। एक समय था जबकि मेंटेनेंस राइट का मतलब होता था कि मेरे पति के वर्चस्व में जितनी ज़मीन है, अगर वो चला गया तो उसके जाने के बाद विधवा महिला को वो सारी ज़मीन के ऊपर मेंटेनेंस के ऊपर राइट होगा, वो उसको मैनेज करेगी। लेकिन फिर एक सेकंड फेज आया जबकि उसको वो सारी ज़मीन का हक नहीं दिया जाता था, केवल उतनी ज़मीन दी जाती थी जितनी कि उसके लिए जरूरी समझी जाए। कि अगर मैंने पति के पास ज़मीन भले 10 एकड़ था तो दिया, पर इसके लिए समाज को लगता है कि 1 एकड़ जरूरी है तो उतनी ही दी जाएगी। लेकिन वर्तमान परिस्थितियों में उसको वो ज़मीन भी नहीं दी जाती, खाली समझा जाता है कि उसको खाली मेंटेनेंस के लिए रहना खाना चाहिए। एंड एवरीवन सिटिंग इन दिस रूम विल प्रोबेबली अंडरस्टैंड कि दैट मेंटेनेंस डजंट कम वेरी रिस्पेक्टफुल। तो इस सारी व्यवस्था में जब औरतों के अधिकार और उनका दिखा जाना अपने आप में इतना कमजोर है कि वो शायद रेन्यूएबल एनर्जी के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हो, चाहे फॉरेस्ट के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हो, चाहे वुड स्टेट के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हो, उनकी स्थिति हमेशा कमजोर है।
Does the audience have any issues with what I said in terms of understanding?
Quick summary
understood that there are certain innate practices. Uh, for instance, she is making how we often understand violence being a very physical coercion thing. But ma'am has went on to extend that often this happens in terms of pressurizing women with regard to the customary holding that she has over land. These practices need not be violent, need not be coerced, but they are very innate forms of violence that often women have to undergo with regard to the customary rights that she has over land. Understanding the fact that women in India are still, most part of it, India is still struggling to get formal ownership, land rights to women. So, very short. This is what I'm saying. Very important points raised by ma'am. I think we often we look at violence from only a very force in terms of coercive lens, but then these are also very psychological parts of it. Some very important points raised. We'll move to Anuj. Anuj, you have conducted very extensive research in the western Rajasthan with regard to RE infrastructures there. With regard to your experience within RE, how do you look at customary territorial rights? And how are these rights overlooked with regard to the current projects?
When we think of Western life or Western most of the pictures that come into our mind is India. And they are certain community and that the market can be used by the Indian state down to capture land. And many of the mainstreaming results, they are unproductive, there is no productivity, there is no bioavailability and everything. But what we found out about the state wanted to follow that there are people who are living in these areas. If the ecosystems are so unproductive, what people are doing. And unfortunately, the ecosystems have their own cycle, own productivity. And over the years, the community living in the area has developed a symbiotic kind of relationship with these people. And that symbiotic kind of relationship in these systems is not based on the formal right, the formal ownership right. In fact, the formal ownership rights, I would say, they are temporary. So they will work only when there will be a rainy season between July to October, when you will be actually farming your own field. But once the farming season is over, for the rest of the 9 months, all of these farms are used as common rather than as a private land. Now, in this sense, your use rights become far more important for your livelihood, for your survival, and which has been given within the culture. Now, who are the users? So it is really not important for the owners of the land, but the most of the livelihood is benefited from the users of the land. Now, who are these users? These users. These are pastoral communities who depend for fodder and the other fodder, water and other things on the common as well as on the private land. And when I am saying common, we should keep in mind the private land de facto it could be owned by the private entity or the private individual. But de facto it is used as a common land. Okay, for most of the year. Now, what we are doing that when there is a transition happening in the desert ecosystem, we are converting the temporary ownership of the land, the temporary private use right of the land into a permanent use right of the land. The moment I take from temporary 3-month use right to the 12-month permanent use right, both of the private and the common land, all other users of the land of the land of the community without it, but actually has been siphoned off. All these uses has been destroyed over the time. Now, who is getting affected? One, the pastoral community is an obvious answer. But who are these pastoral communities? These pastoral communities are usually come from a socio-economic background, caste and community both, and also women. And when I say women, I am talking about the women not only from the Dalit community, but also from the women in the upper class community they go to the common to collect firewood, to collect non-consumer product from experience. It can take time outside the need of the patriarchal structure within their family, but also give them some kind of a financial security because they control the health in the house, they have a control over the produce they have collected from the common. And ultimately what happens is that when we are transitioning from this in these regions where your huge right become more important, your permanent formal title to the RE project, whether compensated or not compensated, they are ultimately going to affect the biggest portion of society, which includes women, Dalits and the other communities. And that can atol the farming infrastructure on these communities in the absence of any formal recognition of life and the formal compensation of life.
Thank you, Arun. So very interesting points. We'll come to it again. We'll move to Professor now. As Himanshu was also mentioning how Supreme Court judgments have been faulty here and there with regard to recognition of customary rights. My question to you is, because you have worked in Northeast and you work extensively on customary law, what are the challenges today at legal level or for legal processes to give recognition to these rights? Can you speak about it?
See, land is one of the biggest assets of any nation. Obviously, without land, you don't have a nation as such. Customarily, we have this land in the form of a deed rights, and no man's land. Whoever comes first, we provide it, and then we say, okay, from day to day, that's my land. Slowly, as civilization progresses, we have the society. From society, we have the kingdoms. And from kingdom today, we have a formal system of government that we have. As I take for example, today when we walk in here, I sat on that chair, right, which is occupied by me. Now, if I have to live here permanently in this room, I will assert on it with all my force. That may go violent as well. Similarly, when society develops, power grows. And as we are humans, we are emotionally weak. And therefore, power becomes our weakness. And therefore, we try to assert. And that's how, when government develops, government is just an association of humans which impose power upon the subjects. So that in the territorial limits, the subjects remain within that particular association of governments. So with that, slowly, in the United States, from the regionalist land battleship, the grow registration process. So in order to assert my right legally, registration process starts. That alienated a large portion of the great Indian nations into a foreign country. Similarly, in India also, we have our own traditional customary battleship, which was not in reports. We say that यहाँ से यहाँ जो है ये हमारा ज़मीन है, वहाँ से वहाँ है वो आपका ज़मीन है, and we कैसे है? So when the colonial rulers started, we slowly adopted those methods of registration. Registration is just a process so that the government establishes its complete control over the land of its subjects. Once registration is done, you are subjected to the law of the state. That means you are submitting yourself. I may have a marriage with her, but if I don't get my marriage registered, government is no one to say. I may have a dispute with him, but unless I go to the court of law or take it to the authority has nothing to say. We may dare ourselves, right? So that's where we allow the state to interfere in our own rights. But in that process, we are talking about customary now. In the modern customary, we only refer to the sections or the residential car sections, etc. Customary also refers to the, to the higher sections of the society as well. You also have your own customs. You also have the same plot of land in the same nation. And therefore, the context of customary should not be restricted only to the tribe. It should be applied equally as well to the higher sections of the society. Right? So, if I remember internationally, in Australia, the Queensland case, the Marco versus the Queensland case, the Supreme Court of Australia has clearly said that a state act, that means a state legislation, cannot do away with the traditional rights of that. But movement is still going. Similarly, in India, as I said, Supreme Court is to some extent, changing its opinion depending upon the nature of the case. In some cases, the Supreme Court asserts to the original traditional rights. But in some cases, the Supreme Court favors the imminent domain rather than the traditional customary rights. Right? As for example, if we go to the Chudanapur Plagiaries case, that was long time back in the 60s. The Supreme Court has clearly said that we will not interfere with the traditional customs in the Chudanapur. But today, when we come to the environmental context case, when the Supreme Court looks from the environmental context case, the Supreme Court, on the principle of sustainable development, make alternative arrangements and eliminate the tribal population spaces from their, indigenous inhabitant area and rehabilitated to a somewhere different area. Right? So the Supreme Court looks those cases from different angles, and therefore sometimes it is very difficult to generalize what opinion is in the mind of the Honorable Supreme Court. Now again, for example, if we go into the Jaipur Development Authority case, the Supreme Court has clearly said that you cannot take away an individual land because that is his traditional right. And even though we have amended, repealed the right to property under the fundamental rights, but still it is a constitutional and a legal right, and therefore you cannot just throw away somebody from the land. So the Supreme Court keeps on changing the judgments depending upon the context in which it is challenged. First one. And that is what is very important in litigation, that when you challenge a case in the court of law, the foundation is very important, because the court will only frame 2 or 3 cause of actions, issues, and actually get upon it. Because the court will only listen to what you argue. The court cannot bring in something from here or something from there. It is what you argue. And therefore, I always advise when you go for litigation, you choose the right lawyer to discuss what subject you have to challenge. If you challenge in the wrong direction, the Supreme Court will give a wrong order, and your cause will be lost in the process. And that is how in that way I will answer your question, because I don't want to take much time, because it will keep on explaining. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, sir. I think some very interesting slides on these. We'll move from what customary tenure rights mean to giving it a more structural recognition. And so we'll start with Anuj this time. Anuj, you were talking about how various ways in which RE infrastructures have neglected customary tenure rights. In that case, I mean, how do we move beyond a monetary model for the implementation of customary tenure rights within RE, and can we secure an alternative livelihood for these displaced communities?
So coming to that, I think why customary rights become more important in the age of the army. India never had a justified land and has been taken over by the state for development. But then why we are discussing army and what makes army do this? And one of the things army makes so different is that multiply factor is very big. Even like when we were building a steel plant in Odisha or steel plant in Bengal, large number of the people have been acquitted from their land. And they have never been confronted with reality, right? But when these kind of steel plants or the large industrial plants are coming, they also come up with a large informal economy which parallelly develop along with these. Although you don't, state is not compensating them, we can say that it's not justified at all. But at least those industries used to offer some equated job, alienated farmers who have been alienated from their income. While in the case of the army, what happened because it does not offer same kind of the multiplied structure, there are very rare opportunities to absorb the people or absorb the users of the land who have been alienated from their income. And that's why the problem becomes more acute in the case of the army in comparison to the other ones. Now, what could be if the compensation mode, the financial compensation is enough amount of revenue is possible or not, I want to debate. What I see with the army, while I have chosen a particular model of army, but the army also offers certain ways where a coexistence kind of thing can happen in the case of the desert. So like in one of our fields where we found that one of the companies running a guard and return, they have provided grading cards. So like practical communities who have the grading card can go into a certain parts of the plant and allow their community, allow them to actually grade over the plant. Actually, it will help the arbitrage. Arbitrage anyway have to spend their money to cut the guard because ultimately if guard goes larger, your panels will be under the guard after one point of time, which you have to clear the guard. But and then you have to throw it away. So you have to spend a lot of money, a lot of manpower in doing so, but you can do it for free if you allow those kind of things. The second could be a mechanism where if that is what is the goal of the panchayat. And that goal of panchayat is to be very important in institutionalizing that kind of the mechanism. Unfortunately, under the current formal legal system, the army has given a free run in the name of green energy, sustainability, and go there. And because of that, there is no regulation. One of the casualty of effort is our local government institutions like panchayat. The panchayat are nowhere in the loop, even with the large area parks such as in Gujarat, we can cover where in Gujarat and Rajasthan, Bhadla and other parts. The local panchayats have no power to regulate it. Why? If a legal mechanism can be established, the local panchayat can become the formal forum to negotiate between the community and the army company. And it is not that the army companies can circumvent the local politics completely, they cannot. Because of many conflicts on the land or the usage of the land, they have to go through the informal mechanism to make sure that there are no conflicts and their projects are not getting used. They have to spend large amount of the money on these informal networks and mechanisms. So here if we can find a mechanism of the synergy between the users of the land and the army project development. The second is the strengthening the role of the local panchayat in renewable energy development could be one idea which can promote development of the renewable energy infrastructure with having a lead cost for local communities or kind of coexistence or a symbiotic relationship which has developed over countries. So I would argue that rather than importing our infrastructure and putting it and just clearing the land and putting our infrastructure, it would have been a better approach if we leave the our infrastructure within the symbiotic relationship between the community and the land which has got developed in very ecosystem over countries.
Thank you, Anika. These are very interesting points and something to also again, particularly within large RE infrastructure in Western Rajasthan. We'll come to Shipra ma'am. In your previous conversation, you were outlining how there are innate practices of violence which is often created to women. I want to understand how do then women, I mean, not looking as women as a very homogeneous category here, but then how come women as a community often negotiate a recognition of these land democratic rights? Has there been any days, any case study, anything that you can recall? I mean, what are the minor mechanisms through which women can contest or can negotiate their land ownership? Any successful case?
I think in all these scenarios and most of the scenarios where women's rights are kind of fulfilled, I think collective functioning is one way for women to struggle to move beyond it and to overcome all these challenges. Wherever I see some success that women have achieved in claiming their rights, in being able to do better negotiation, it is through the collectives. Because these collectives provides them a safe space, number one, to come together, to discuss, and then they build on each other's energy to negotiate. And it's true in negotiation with the government, with the officials, but also with the customary leaders and within families itself. There have been examples in Odisha, and there are in Odisha, in Jharkhand, in Telangana, and there have been organizations that have been facilitating women's collective strengths, for example, DES in Andhra, Vasundhara in Odisha, Udan in Jharkhand and Madhya Pradesh. And whenever women come together, they are able to negotiate better with the government officials, and they also often step into the terrain where women have traditionally not been into. For example, when it comes to forest rights, traditionally the participation in the forest management committees, etc., was considered to be against law. But after this FRA came into place and women have been provided representation into the forest management committees, many women have come together to negotiate with the government officials, and they have done mapping of their resources, they have done survey of landless communities or people who need things. But I think here I will cite a very intriguing story which I heard from the book of women in Jharkhand. So there was this woman called Diya who belongs to the Santhal tribe. And when she got married, her husband passed away, leaving with her just one daughter who was 1 year old. So after her husband passed away, nobody in her Meraita family wanted her to stay in the Meraita family because she would then be able to obtain a family wealth. So she came back to her parents' house. Now the tradition is that once the daughter has come to the tradition of the Meraita family, invite her to come back. But this did not happen for Geeta, so she did not go back. So a year later, her mother took her with her and dropped her to her Merathi family, but she was not invited there. She suffered a lot of violence. She wasn't able to eat. She became very weak. Her daughter also lost her health, so she came back to her parents' family. Now in her parents' family, she did not have a brother, but she had these male cousins who did not want her to stay in her parents' home, because when she is married and she is somewhere else, then her parents doesn't belong to the cousins. But if she is there, then her parents will belong to the male cousins. So her male cousins also started humiliating her a lot. And in the meantime, her mother passed away, her father passed away. And when her father passed away later, and when her father passed away, her male cousin started saying कि पहले ये जमीन हमारे नाम करो तब हम तुम्हारे पिता का लास्ट राइट करेंगे because traditionally a woman cannot do the last rites. Now this woman, she was not a member of any group, any women's collective, but within that village and in the nearby villages, there was this Ekal Nari Shakti Sangathan, which is like single women's collective. So women of these collectives came to know that there is a woman there who is struggling like this, and these men in her family are not allowing her to create, and they are saying that she should first transfer the land rights to the male cousins and then to the. So this group of women, they themselves approached them, and they gave her the courage. They said कि वो नहीं करे तो तुम खुद कर सकती है. But by herself, that woman would never have the courage कि मैं खुद ही जाके मेरे father का cremation करूँ. But when that collective came together, it gave her the courage to do the cremation and in turn keep the land, preserve the land rights. So that's how all of this is so complex. It's not just very linear always the right area and that's how I think that this one particular instance just shows me the power of women and how it helps negotiate within families, it helps negotiate with cultural norms, it helps negotiate with the state and the rights and the position.
I think over recent years we have seen how collective action from the marginalized communities have made some impact on various dimensions. So we'll move with Professor August time. So you were referring how, with regard to legal jurisprudence and to go about legal processes, we need to have right demands also from the Supreme Court. But I believe in the recent years there have been some dissidence with regard to the recognition of customary tenure rights. So can you talk about any recent judgment in India or elsewhere, or what are the legal processes that we can adopt today which can give more recognition to the customary tenure rights? Something from let's say the last 10 years can you reflect on?
We would say customary tenure in cases of the Supreme Court, in the context of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court will go on a specific legislation that will make an issue before the Supreme Court. That happens in mostly of the northeastern states and the hill settled areas. And in the rest of the nation, people do not consider the ownership as a customary right because of the caste system or maybe of the higher society thing. That's a different thing which legislation in a social context has to be changed. In that case, regarding the question, I believe that Supreme Court has been consistently recognizing the customs so far as we challenge, but subject to the imminent dominance. Obviously, we live in an age, and for economic coordination of the nation, since we are in a federation, it is very important that the imminent dominance prevails over the rest of the fundamental rights that we have, irrespective of the customs that we have. Customs, as says in the Constitution, we mostly refer to Article 13 of the Constitution and Article 29, Clause 1. Other than that, we have no such codified law, because customs cannot be codified. The moment you codify customs, then that is the end of one traditional civilization. So, in order to bring in line with the formal system, the government started registration process. The government tried to make a code on customs regarding various rights, that includes land as well. But still there remains a system which cannot be covered by a codified law. Right? As for example, what man was talking about under the Hindu law, it's a personal law. It's been custom has been codified, and right has been given to one. But there are still some other smaller sections of the society in India where customs cannot be qualified and society cannot accept such a law which can be in par with the rest of the society. Right? As for example, you will find it, taking the example of the Sultanapur areas, women still do not have a right of property, they do not inherit northeastern states, except Meghalaya, the rest of the states women cannot inherit, etc., etc. And the Supreme Court in such matters cannot interfere because that is a social issue. And if Supreme Court tries to bring in strictly the fundamental rights on it and make it par with the rest of the fundamental rights, then it will create a social chaos. And the Supreme Court obviously would not like to create a social chaos because of its judgment that we have seen recently in Manipur. The High Court judgment has sparked, has created fire in the state, which is a serious matter, even till unable to resolve, right? So, custom as such should be left alone, right? Let the society handle it. Bringing in a codified legislation or the Supreme Court, adversely coming into the picture will obviously affect society. Judiciary as such is blind. So judiciary will only go on the line where lawyers argue. Judiciary, even though the judge might be aware of the false surrounding, but he will not bring in those false surrounding. He will argue or he will give a judgment on the argument what the lawyer says. And that is not where customs as such. Therefore, the framers of our constitution were very careful. And therefore, in Article 13 of the Constitution, we have only made that only those customs that are violative of Part 3 of the Constitution, these are fundamental rights of the Constitution, will be ultra-virus to that extent. And therefore, all the customs remain valid unless they are contrary to the fundamental rights. And therefore, the customs will go on. So, I have quoted the judgment of the Mahbus case of the Australian Supreme Court. And I think in India also that goes well because it is already a constitutionally settled matter that to what extent the customs are valid and to what extent the customs are not valid. So I think the matter is there.
So very important. We'll come finally to Professor Himanshu. Sir, I want, so particularly let's say from governance and policy framework, what changes do you think can be made, particularly with regard to the current scenario keeping in mind, in order to give recognition to these customary tenure rights? I mean, particularly from the governance and policy framework perspective.
Before we come to the recognition of traditionally established access rights, and which I quoted from the case which was prior to FRP. And I believe in part the kind of parliament elections, even for traditionally established access rights holder, the President Bishop of Community, although when document like that the Church of Grace, wonderful Commissioner Introduction of India, the moon and the net. Partly, although the President Bishop of didn't win the justice in the case, paved the way for Indian Parliament to recognize that there are forest dwellers who have been inhabiting forests, who have been cultivating the forest. And again, environmental history, we have to draw from academic resources also, right? You look at David Hartman's book in the Times in Gujarat, his paper is called The Farm in the Forest. And so forest bureaucracy will have to start reading environmental history. They cannot just look at revenue records and live in the era of British colonial forest governance. That paved the way for Indian Parliament to say that there has been incident of injustice, we want to give and recognize who are they to give. The language, if you read the preamble of FRA 2006 is that these rights have existed and they have carried on cultivation. So those rights are hereby recognized and they laid down a process by which the FRA implementation will take. Now it's anyone's guess from 2006, 20 years later, where are we? But the kind of violent evictions that we used to see in forest land in the name of clearing encroachments that we saw in 2002, we haven't seen in the last 20 years. So that has nothing. Having said that, there has also been landslide. We have gone 2 steps ahead, 4 steps back, as the algorithm was in Gujarat. Why am I saying that? We have in India a working constitution, under which we have established constitutional institutions. So in India, there is a constitutional institution called the CAB of India, which can undertake a performance audit of 100 land acquisition cases in Odisha, specifically in Schedule 6 area. So scheduled area, non-scheduled area. Gram Sabha's consent is an inevitable step before which the collector cannot declare a vote, cannot start distributing the compensation. The land acquisition cannot move onwards. Look at the audit report that has been in public domain by the CAB of India. Odisha's assembly got it tabled on 11 September 2024. I looked at this audit report last week when I was doing a post in one of the mining affected districts in Odisha. And to my point, even when the record of the Gram Sabha clearly had suggested that people resolved that they will not let 1 acre of the land go for the mining expansion, the land acquisition still went. So that's a violation. And when a constitutionally established globally, who are the institutions like CAB of India called? They are called Supreme Court institutions. There is a lot of work that exists in media and academia on Supreme Court, but we need to do equally important work on what happens to CAB of India. Once they are tabled in Parliament, once they are tabled in Assembly. And what have been the consequences after that September 11, 2024 report, which is in public domain, Public Accounts Committee should have taken cognizance by now, because it has been more than a year now. Heads must roll, and the district collector has neglected his constitutional duty that this nation imposed on him of upholding the constitutionally established rights of the tribals of Odisha. And what has happened to them? What has happened to the revenue system? So, we have gone 2 steps ahead. As I said in FRA, we would not see that sort of violent evictions that used to happen in 2002. But again, in FRA again, the Supreme Court now and then keeps hearing the matter. And this kind of reports, when they enter public domain, they were looking at the files in Sundargarh, and they asked the revenue office and district collector's office that where are the records of this 26 cases of land acquisition. The reply that has gone on record in the CAG audit report is a reply where the executive agency said the records are missing. That is a reply on report. So, the kind of base and undermining of certain constitutional institutions that we have seen in recent times should allow us to again understand that if India has to develop to the Viksit Bharat stage in 2024, better we look back at what was the vision of the framework of our constitution, how they gave us people this republic, and we must assert the independence of constitutional institutions and their recommendations. That executive must follow the recommendations of constitutional institutions in specific stage of it.
I think these are very important institutional gaps that are important. And I want to stay with you and actually build on this a little bit. I think one of the problems with recognition of these customary rights is also how do we quantify them, how do we measure them. So with regard to that, what are the alternative frameworks that we can suggest from policy and governance level, which can bring about a recognition or at least address these logistical challenges of quantifying these rights?
Someone really profoundly says that everything that matters cannot be measured. And everything that can be measured cannot be things that matter in society. Okay, so there are certain things that would not lend itself to the quantification and statistics. For example, before India's Green Revolution, there existed a symbiotic relationship that gets captured beautifully in the song in the film Marches by Gujarat. When those young guys go, what is the song that is being sung? And there is a Himachali pastoral guy who is with this landed youth of Punjab. And what is the chemistry there? What does it talk about? Before India's Green Revolution, farmers, settled cultivators used to welcome pastoral herds because those herds brought fertility. We didn't have chemical fertilizers. And that relationality, there was no written context. The village sarpanch didn't say, this from Himachal would be welcome. This is a traditionally established land relationality. Some land use would happen when the land is fallow. The goats will come and graze, they'll move away. The pastoral herd will move on its. And that used to happen in this part of the world, in Western India. For example, herds will move from Rajasthan, will come to Madhya Pradesh. Sometime in 1980s, there this relationality broke down because the political economy of settled cultivation changed, the cropping patterns changed, the Green Revolution had come up. So by 1980s, what do you see? That the forest department of Madhya Pradesh is also saying, no, these herds cannot enter the forest because reserve forest, we cannot allow herds to enter and graze. The settled cultivators of Madhya Pradesh also started being violent, and there was violent conflict. So one is not painting a very rosy picture of symbiotic relationality between different groups. But if you look at pastoral people in India, what is it that they are asking us to recognize? Long back in the case of Dunlop versus Gram Panchayat in Goa, one specific community in the village was demanding that the passage that we had, where we used to move over herds, has been taken over because the Dunlop has built a compound wall. And I have to negotiate now a large, and that's not what my herd is used to. This has been a traditional path that I have to do. And I must be even access back to the traditional path. He is not demanding 24/7, 365 days land rights. He is not asking that he will cultivate the piece of that land on which the company exists. But he has a memory of using that path. In Himachal, now with a technology changing, there is an effort. I must congratulate the colleagues in Center for Pastoralism, which is a research think tank. Now with technology and tracking data, the paths can be there on the map. And so the certain things that can lend itself to speciality now must be recognized. And negotiations will have to start, which is what the Center for Pastoralism is doing with Himachal Pradesh Forest Department. And similar things can happen in Rajasthan, similar things can happen in Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh. This usage rights, foraging, usufruct rights, right? People have this very weird understanding of looking at land rights only as land titles and the imagination of settled culture. That was something that we were locked into when late British colonial era only looked at settled cultivators and looked at within settled cultivators someone who grew cotton as the progressive farmer. But we need to come out of that era and we need to recognize that there are wetlands. So for example, just with this last example of Tamil Nadu wetland, there was an SEZ case which PUCL was fighting against with the village communities. I could say we must compensate, but how did I compensate it? The pastoral people who used to take their herds to this land for grazing, and there used to be water commons also, there were wetlands. 7 villages depended on that wetland in one SEZ. I could say, in order to compensate, we will hereby direct the Animal Husbandry Department of Tamil Nadu state to cultivate fodder in a land of this much acre. Okay? So, sometimes when in legal jurisprudence compensation mechanism comes in, again there is a very weird understanding of not understanding what is personal mobility and what is open grazing foraging animals. Correct? It's sometimes you would see again this lens of saying that stone-fed animals is the mainstay, and so we will make sure that there is some fodder that is coming from somewhere. So the cultivated fodder, and again, when compensating mechanism comes, that's why I said everything that is measured cannot be the means of better. And so we need to go beyond some of these traditional methods. How do you establish what has been existing there as a land right, which is not settled cultivation oriented land rights? Usufruct rights has to be recognized. Use the right of passage. The right of passage becomes a very important issue. Okay? People say linear projects do not do violence. When you are looking at linear projects not doing violence, you are not recognizing that some of these hybrids and linear projects that we are talking about actually are cutting the same traditionally established access rights on that piece of land that we are saying not a large scale displacement, not thousands of acres. But for that bird, for that nomad, what does it do? What does this? We have this expressway between Baroda and Ahmedabad. What it would have done to several farmers who still have to go to their farm in the bullock cart because they have not been able to buy a tractor. But do society ask this question? Do project developers when they want to own Viksit Bharat of 2027 ask this question?
I want Anuj to actually also get down on Professor Maharshi's argument, but of course with specific preference to the renewable energy sector. How can we then imagine the compensatory mechanisms which Professor Maharshi was mentioning? How would they look like? Any different or with specific preference to our
look area going on filling everything we are something was there company goes to the of the land and the leader. Unfortunately or like very cleverly the government will confirm that in case of the RE project, in RE they didn't land it to the they are not talking about now if you are not acquiring land for the then you are not actually, when you are not acquiring, you don't need to compensate anybody. And that's a biggest model which will become the military of RE for. Now, one of the things I believe that there is a two-part problem. One is the agential problem. The many of these users are politically, economically, and socially distant. Even the Mao and President One was like that even if we give them some legal rights, whether they are enough as power to implement, to ask for the implementation of those legal rights or not. That's the work. And I completely agree with Mr. Mao and Mr. One that despite having laws, there are gruesome violations of law, even the tables of equality, at least they will come there, at least there will come equality, at least there are some ways where somebody has to present challenge that. But in the case of the RE, we do not have that at all. We cannot, I don't know like how to challenge a land using case in the case of the RE because on the paper, no law has been violated. We don't require environmental law. There are no economic laws, there are no people laws, there are no ecological, there are no other there are no political laws that are applicable nowadays. And if no law is applicable, then as Professor Martin was saying, I am going to because one thing is that everything despite of redundancy and the weakness of the current legal system in the case of the those laws should be extended to And then there needs to be some form of identical building of the community so that they can demand those third thing that technology can become really important as a set of actually that it's all of people that they do not have data. Who is doing they do the land survey. So the land survey ultimately who own the land. Some parts like the coastal like they do not use the land, but they are very good. Not like actually water actually. It can be used technology now. To understand what kind of uses are actually they want to come. And can those uses symbiotically included within the army sector? There could be some kind of some mechanism which are not necessarily financial compensatory mechanism, which are non-financial compensatory mechanism, which can include users, which can include building up within this ecosystem to make sure that their lives are not being like they have been very clear and important role both in FRA and giving consent to the developmental project, or not giving consent to the developmental project. Similar kind of role the local panchayats and say. Although I do recognize that the panchayat in tribal areas are very different panchayats in the non-tribal areas. Panchayats in tribal areas are more that have only on the power structure, but they only have what is the power structure and how they will play out the education. But at least there can be some inches of the rolling of the ball, whatever is between those kind of things within the region and then around female.
I'll carry this argument of your language and come to Shikha ma'am for while I think there are talks among the panelists about how panchayat can play a very important role in the institution building, we know how women have also been, I mean, we forget how women are marginalized in these various spaces as well with regard to whether they're sitting on village councils, even if they are the sarpanches, we have the male counterpart, the male husband who basically runs the governments. So in that regard, how can women as a community, I mean, how do we then look at agency and institutional challenges, and what are the frameworks should women then work through to give, to have a more recognition of their user rights and
मुझे लगता है जो मेन स्ट्रीम थिंकिंग रही है ना लैंड के अराउंड, लैंड बिलोंग्स टू दी हाउस होल्ड, और हम सोचते रहे हैं कि हाउस होल्ड के अंदर जितने भी लोग हैं उन सबके इंटरेस्ट एक जैसे होते कि एक परिवार की जमीन में जो सबके इंटरेस्ट है टेकन केयर ऑफ, ये सच नहीं है। उसके अंदर बहुत सारे इंट्रा डायनेमिक्स होते हैं और मेन विमेन डायनेमिक्स बहुत प्रोनाउंस्ड होते हैं जिसके अंदर। तो मुझे लगता है जो फेमिनिस्ट जूरिस्प्रूडेंस है हम क्या देखते हैं, हम फेमिनिस्ट जूरिस्प्रूडेंस देखते हैं कि व्हाट इज हैपनिंग टू ईच एंड एवरी वुमन because what's happening to different kinds of women, what is their lived reality. That is not just a lifeless asset, but it's a lived reality, it's a relational context. The relation that I have with a piece of land versus the relation which a tribal woman would have or a pastoralist woman would have might be different. So, the feminist jurisprudence suggests that all of these are these need to be seen in the context of lived reality. और जब हम कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल राइट्स की बात करते हैं तो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल राइट्स टू इक्वालिटी, राइट्स टू डिग्निटी, हाउ डू दे इंटरसेक्ट विद कस्टम्स एंड ट्रेडिशंस? जो हम जिस केओस को बचाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, केओस कहीं ऐसा तो नहीं कि औरतों के हाथों में खड़ा हुआ है और शांति जोड़ने के लिए, तो उस सब चीज़ को देखने की ज़रूरत है so that each and every individual जो सिंगल है, ट्राइबल है, दिल्ली में बैठी है या फिर झारखंड के किसी गुंडा में बैठी है, but each and every one उसके लिए लॉ में क्या एडजस्टमेंट किया जाना चाहिए, में क्या किया जाना चाहिए, रेवेन्यू लॉ में क्या किया जाना चाहिए। जब वो इन चीज़ों को नहीं देखते थे तो जो कानून की भाषा है वो भी मिट्टी आते हैं, जो कानून के प्रोविजंस है उसमें भी वो गैप है। ट्रेडिशनली कुछ यही सोचते रहे हैं कि मैन इज द लैंड होल्डर, वही टिलर है, लैंड टू द टिलर हैज बीन द टैगलाइन ऑफ ऑल द लैंड डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन इन दैट रिस्पॉन्स दैट वाज। बट feminist thinking helps us think beyond this in context of the lived realities, and I think lived realities are what matter more to people who are young. उस तरह की जस्ट वही एक तरीका है कि हम सब चीज़ों को लोगों के हित में कर पाएँ, क्योंकि पॉलिसी ज़्यादा ज़रूरी है या लॉ ज़्यादा ज़रूरी है या लोगों की रोज जी जाने वाली जिंदगी, इसके लिए भी ज़रूरी है वो एडजस्टमेंट लॉ और पॉलिसी में होनी चाहिए।
For the sake of the audience, ma'am is saying that there must be an adjustment in feminist jurisprudence to acknowledge women's direct rights. And I think I'll close then the discussion, at least from my side, because all the three panelists are saying how laws needs to be extended. So I'll come finally to Professor Rao with regard to how everyone out there saying that yes, laws need to be extended. And let's, if we go beyond LAR 2020, what are the fundamental shifts required for
Compensation is not the issue. Because you cannot compensate your rights. It is impossible to compensate your traditional or your cultural rights. It's not like छोले में भी खाना आप दे दो काट दिया और वो compensate किया वैसा नहीं होता है. So it is impossible. So we cannot sell. In other words, we cannot sell our traditional rights to the government or to any other authority. See, government also goes for some other authorities. So we cannot sell our traditional rights to a private entity or even to a government entity. Or do it for the security of it. That's a different thing. And therefore, when it comes to compensation and such, then it is only for the security and national interests. The rest, we cannot sell our rights. Right? Now, I'll just give you an example of which is not customary, but which is general, right? The limit, practical. Sir, आपके campus के adjoining में एक
Open the
society,
floor for question.
that Dayal
Can
society,
we open the floor for
right?
questions
That
for
society,
the audience?
that was a land which was taken from GNU campus, and then there are some GNU officers involved in it. और सोसाइटी बनाया अच्छा से लंबा का मंजिल का कार सोसाइटी बनाया. Similarly, in Delhi University, adjoining to the Delhi University, there was a plot of land which was given to the metro for public purposes. So all these lands, both lands, were converted from the public purpose lands into housing societies. Right? The EU, we fought it because we do not want a high-rise building adjoining the campus, because it will destroy the beauty of the campus, number one. It will bring a lot of population, etc. We fight for almost 6-7 years, and finally we won. Secondly, when it comes to your society, the society owned the matter is the Supreme Court gave a judgment after almost 15 years that okay, now it is a properly allowed land. Now the difference is that a public land being converted. In Delhi University, we won in favor of the university. But in the GNU case, GNU lost. And in that, I will not name it, one prominent legal personality is involved in both cases. That's the reason. Right? उनका घर GNU कैंपस में था, तो उनका जीत गया, और वो वहाँ प्रोफेसर है, तो वो जीत गया. ठीक है ना? वैसा है. The legal system is covered. And therefore, the legal system in India is quite flexible. It can be turned this side and that side as well. Similarly, when it comes to our cultural rights, traditional rights, चाहे वो आप पंचायत करो या चाहे वो ग्राम सभा करो, that it's not a written law, and therefore federation can be molded according to the person in the chair. Right? If I remember again, I know one case, the Nemgai's case, the Odisha mining wala case. After a long debate, the Supreme Court said that the village panchayat, the Gram Sabha, is the primary authority to decide who is the owner of the land, who has the right over the land. And now I do not know what the Gram Sabha has done it. The moment even the Supreme Court gives an authority to the Gram Sabha, the management becomes a little different. Now, we cannot blame the legislation as well, we cannot blame the administration as well in such a situation. There are middle persons involved in it. Right? There are middle persons who are playing in the middle. But these middle persons neither come into the eye of the law or neither come under the eye of the bureaucracy. And that middleman may be me also, or several. Right? And that is where we need to be careful in coming to a conclusion of asserting what our right is. Right? As an activist or as a beautiful citizen, I will always assert that our federational rights, which is granted by the Constitution, protected under Article 29 and 13 of the Constitution, cannot be sold at any cost. Compensation is amounts to same. That's it.
We'll open the floor to the audience. Just let me have Yeah, sure.
Actually, the judgment has to be carried out because the operational part of the judgment I thought has to be appointed by judges who oversee the Gram Sabha process. Gram Sabhas have to be only 12 Gram Sabhas, and the outcome was 12 by 3. People say that Niyamit is a second goal. It's not just a mountain beneath which there is a bauxite that is coming in once a month. This is our cultural belief. And that's what the Supreme Court also said. The Supreme Court said FRA grants not just individual rights, collective forest rights, there is a third right, which is the cultural right. And who is the arbitrator whether the cultural right holds? It's the Gram Sabha, it's not us. So the right must know that Gram Sabha, that is the issue. I have taken more than half a minute.
We can take two, so now.
Yeah, my question is for Anuj. In relation to Rajasthan, I think you also mentioned this issue of wasteland category is critical. And in a sense, the government has almost full authority over how those allocations can be, given to the private sector, whereas there's lots of customary rights being held over that type of land. And as you said, panchayats don't really have any role in all of this. And I think what's missing here is a kind of consideration of who are the custodians of customary tenure in terms of governance system. So Gram Sabha is just a formal elected body, but there must be others who are in some sort of and really, we know that there's some debate about whether this might be useful or not. What have you seen in terms of actually how negotiations have occurred over land which is in the wasteland?
India has a population of 18% of the world, and we have a 2.7% of land. In such a country, there is not even an inch of land which can be built. If I go into a little history of the wasteland, the term wasteland started appearing in Indian laws somewhere around 70s, 90s. And how this term has started using the what is the waste? The waste was that is not generating any revenue. It has nothing to do with the ecological responsibility. Unfortunately, in the current 1957, we have continued with category called weight class. And I can give you an example from Tamil Nadu. In 1950s and 70s, the weight class in Tamil Nadu has been converted into wheelland with a particular variety of which we call Videti bamboo in India. I'm forgetting the botanical name. And yeah, that's and the same wetland, which has been converted into greenland in 1970s, has remained wetland on the paper, and in 2006-2007, that wetland has been again allotted to get to clear up and produce Jetco farm. Okay. So the wetland as a category is not as much not the land facility, go about a legal mechanism to take over the common land which has been used for multiple years. We have a similar kind of experience in Rajasthan, in the case of the renewable energy, where government put a RE plant saying it is a waste plant, it's a no use, but actually there are thousands of users which are actually using their land for all kinds of uses, for pastoralism, for cultivation, for collecting food, vegetables and other things. So they are very active ecosystems rather than just solitary waste plants.
Samiksha, can we please first off, just last, there we
Thank you so much for the panel. It was very informative. My question is on just transitions policy. So, as you know, a lot of states are coming up with just transition, passport just transition policies, and the fundamental structure of just transitions framework is based on several dimensions of justice, including recognition justice, which does ask for recognition of a lot of customary rights as well. So do you think, does the panel think that there is any avenue or a potential within the just transitions policy work that's happening in providing recognition rights to customary rights as well? Secondly, in the state of Rajasthan, because I know some of you work with Rajasthan, do you see any developments of just transitions work in the context of recognition of customary rights?
You rightly pointed out that there is a evidence to the West Pakistan. Unfortunately, all the dimensions do not get the equal. I see there are definitely three dimensions, but my question will be like justice for me. There are plenty of procedural justice, there can be a recognition justice of substantive justice. But what I feel is the power play is very important within the just transition. Often, the communities which are not totally politically or financially empowered, they are largely ignored, including in the building and expansion framework, in the name of efficiency, in the name of financial finance and other things. And that's an unfortunate situation which I see in India, both in the renewable energy sector as well as in the traditional thermal power in India.
Thank you for your questions. If the audience has more questions, they can redirect it to the panelists later on. We really have to finish their friendly session. My gratitude to ILDC for helping us organize this panel, as well as to all our panelists for taking